and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies and TV shows with history. Today we're taking a look at the Starz TV series called Black Sails. Created by Jonathan E. Steinberg and Robert Levine, Black Sails had 4 seasons that ran from 2014 until 2017. And overall, the show is set up to be a prequel to the events of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novel called Treasure Island. Now, in case it's been a little bit since you've seen Black Sails, let's hop right into our quick synopsis of each season. During the first season, a lot of the characters and places are set up as we're introduced to the ruthless Captain Flint, operating out of New Providence Island, a haven for the pirates in the Bahamas. To help maintain his captaincy, Flint is looking for a legendary Spanish treasure ship known as the Urca de Lima, while evading other pirates as well as the British Royal Navy. Enter a couple other characters, John Silver, who joins Flint's crew as a cook before quickly rising in the ranks. Then there's Eleanor Guthrie, whose role running her father's business has turned her into one of the most powerful people on the island. In season 2, it picks up the story right from the end of the first season as Flint's crew finds the Urca gold and has to figure out how to take it without anyone else noticing and taking the gold for themselves, of course, as pirates do. Some other pirates start playing bigger roles as Charles Vane takes over the fort on New Providence, while Jack Rackham and Anne Bonny start building alliances and betrayals behind the scenes. At the end of season 2, Flint is captured and almost killed in Charlestown by Carolina Governor Peter Ashe. But then Charles Vane comes to save the day and Flint's life at just the last moment. Any fighting among the pirates seems to be at an end as they have to face the civilized world if they want to survive. That's easier said than done in season 3 as we're introduced to a couple new characters. Blackbeard, the notorious pirate who was Charles Vane's mentor and arrives in Nassau to help the pirates. And then there's Woodes Rogers, who arrives with backing from England in an attempt to restore law and order. He starts by offering pardons for anyone who wants to turn away from a life of piracy, which causes a lot of new uneasiness among the pirates. Everyone's offered a pardon, that is, except for Charles Vane because of his attack on Charlestown. Near the end of season 3, Charles Vane is captured and executed, which convinces a lot of other pirates to team up against Rogers and the British Navy. Unlike a lot of TV shows that just go on and on, the story in Black Sails wraps itself up in season 4 as Woodes Rogers and his new bride, Eleanor Guthrie, clash with the remaining pirates. Rogers is forced to flee, but he ends up capturing and killing Blackbeard before teaming up with the Spanish to come back to Nassau. It all comes to an end on Skeleton Island, where Flint buries the Urca gold before the final showdown in the series that leaves a mark on the Golden Age of Piracy, while leading right into the events that we learn about in Robert Louis Stevenson's classic book, Treasure Island. Okay. Now, I know that was a lot, but of course, that is still just a quick summary of the 4 seasons of Black Sails. To help us separate fact from fiction in this series, we'll be talking to Colin Woodard, the acclaimed journalist and author of The Republic of Pirates, being the true and surprising story of the Caribbean pirates and the man who brought them down. Before we bring Colin on to talk about the real history, though, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Black Sails' backstory for Woodes Rogers being shot in the face really happened. Number 2, Skeleton Island is not a real island. Number 3, Woodes Rogers really did kill Blackbeard the way we see in the series. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Colin Woodard about the historical accuracy of Black Sails. Black Sails is a prequel to Robert Louis Stevenson's novel from 1883 called Treasure Island. That means we have multiple layers of fiction to unravel from both the novel it's based on, as well as the mere fact that it's a dramatized TV series with its own fictional elements. But of course, pirates really did exist. And I know you mentioned the series was better than you expected it to be before watching it. So before we get into some of the details, just to get an overall sense of how well it captured the essence of the Golden Age of piracy, if you were to give Black Sails a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
Uh, if I'm not framing it around the fact that it's a work of fiction and drama, I'd say, like a B plus, and maybe an A minus if you're taking into account that it's a work of fiction and has to have the drama and all the rest. Yeah, the broad, they have 4 seasons of action, and the broad narrative in big strokes is fairly accurate. The beginning of a pirate republic. It's the Spanish gold in a wrecked treasure fleet, and its role in the increase of the prestige of the republic and the stakes and the infuriating the Spanish, and eventually the efforts of the empire and forces of order to try to re-seize the place, and the tensions between all of those things. They are mixing in real people who were there at the time and the characters in their younger form from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. The math and timing works out pretty well for that, so sure, that would be okay. And of course, because it's dramatized, a lot of events are conflated, characters shifted around. A number of characters who were important to the historic Pirate Republic in Nassau were eliminated to make space for some of the Robert Louis Stevenson characters. So in the details of the plot are kind of all over the place, but the broad story is the same. And what really intrigued me was, and has me giving them a relatively high grade, is whenever they had a situation where they needed a specific detail, it was surprising how often they went out of their way to make it accurate. The ships being named right, the minor characters you never meet who are always off screen being given the proper names. At one point, Jack Rackham is sitting on taking a crap, and he's reading a newspaper, and he's in fact reading the Jamaica Weekly Current, and I've read those on microfilm. There's not that many that have survived, but it's the actual flag from the Jamaica Weekly Current. The masthead is all the same, and they could have cut corners and all of that, but didn't. So I was surprised at the degree to which they went down into the details to be as accurate as possible in some of the fine tuning and livery over the script.
You don't get that a lot with all the little details. They just kind of make that up, and nobody's going to notice that kind of thing anyway. So a lot of shows overlook that. So I'm glad that they stuck to that. Yeah,
they did. I was impressed with that. So yeah, so it's basically really big shapes are accurate, really small things are very accurate. The middle range is where they played with and adapted the actual historical storyline and created their own plots. But they inserted all of their plots in a broad story that thematically was fairly accurate to history.
Sure. You mentioned some of the characters, and I want to ask about that kind of, again, looking overall, because there are 4 seasons. And so there's a lot of characters, and a lot of TV shows do make up fictional characters. And then, of course, we have the characters from Treasure Island. So I kind of broke them down into 3 different categories. There's the real pirates, there's the characters from Treasure Island, and then I'm assuming anybody that doesn't fit into those is just kind of made up for Black Sails. So just to give a brief overview of those, I would say I think the real pirates are Edward Teach, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Benjamin Hornigold, Woodes Rogers, and Israel Hands. The characters from Treasure Island, James Flint, also known as James McGraw, Billy Bones, Long John Silver. And then I'm assuming the rest are kind of made up for Black Sails, the Guthrie family, most notably in the series, Eleanor and Richard, Max, Mr. Scott, Lord Thomas Hamilton, Miranda Hamilton, those characters. Is that a pretty good summary of the categories for the characters in the series?
Yeah, correct. That's exactly right. I'd add a 4th category of major figures from the actual history who were removed. You're missing Stede Bonnet, Black Sam Bellamy, although he's mentioned, and Henry Jennings is barely in there at all, even though he played a critical role in the actual events. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I'm glad you added those that were removed, because I didn't see those in the series. So.
Mary Reed, Anne Bonny's partner in crime, is also entirely eliminated from this universe.
In this series, she's kind of with Jack Rackham. Was that not necessarily the case then? She was with somebody else?
She was with Jack Rackham, but Jack Rackham, and Mary Read all went off into piracy together. So in the sort of great, myths of piracy, have Mary Read and Anne Bonny, along with Calico Jack, going off and doing their piracy. They just removed Mary Read from it altogether, which is fine, but given what a large profile, perhaps wrongly, the Mary Read Anne Bonny story has with the general public, I was surprised that they didn't sort of at least mention why she was off stage or wasn't there. Okay.
Yeah, they actually do at the very end of the last episode. We'll get to that. They do bring her in at the very end, but we'll get to that. Now that we've kind of established some of the people, I want to start digging into some of the details of Black Sails, showing how it sets up the time and place in history. And this is according to the very first episode, first season. It talks about it's the year 1715. Pirates of New Providence Island threaten maritime trade in the region of the Bahamas. The laws of civilized nations declare them enemies. And so in return, the pirates adhere to their own war against the world. And then later in the second season, we find out a little bit through flashbacks that it all started when a man named Henry Avery sailed into the port of Nassau in New Providence Island. Once he was there, he bribed the colonial governor to overlook his breaking of the law and allow his men to camp on the beach. And that's basically how the show sets up that the pirates got their foothold in the region. Is that a pretty accurate summary of how piracy actually started in the Bahamas?
Pretty close. So Henry Avery was real. He had made an incredible capture in the Indian Ocean with great brutality of a treasure galleon belonging to the Grand Mogul of India. And there was a global manhunt for him because his piracy had complicated relations for the British East India Company and their trade monopoly in India. The Grand Mogul was arresting their agents and furious at Englishmen everywhere for this outrage. And so there was an all-points bulletin for this Henry Avery guy, like the world's first global manhunt. Everyone was trying to find him. And he skedaddled sort of around the world to where he thought he would be least expected, which was to this, backwater colony, the Bahamas, in 1696. And indeed, he went to the governor. It was very obvious that he was a pirate, but he claimed just to have found this ship he was on, full of treasure and ivory tusks. And so at a time when everyone, including the governors of, the English governors everywhere, were tasked with finding this man at all costs, the governor in the Bahamas was looking the other way, taking all this gold and ivory, and was given the Grand Mogul's ship as his personal prize in exchange for some small vessels. And Henry Avery he didn't stay there and start a pirate republic. Instead, he basically fenced a bunch of his goods to the governor, and then he and his men slowly trickled out in small vessels and made their way up the eastern seaboard, and most of them back through the back door back to Ireland and England. And Henry Avery was last seen before he disappeared into the mists of history at a crossroads on his way towards the West Country where he was born, known to be in the company of a woman he was not married to, and was married to another, and another man's wife, and a large amount of treasure. So he didn't found the Republic, but when Henry Avery disappeared into the night, it started this legend and lore. When these pirates, remember the show is accurate in saying that the Pirate Republic kind of got underway in 1715 or so, but this is by the next generation of sailors who became pirates, who were inspired by Henry Avery. As they'd been growing up, there'd been plays and novels and sonnets, and all of the multimedia entertainment apparatus of the day was taking the Avery story and embellishing it. And the myth was that this guy had gotten away with it. In some versions of the story, he'd gone to Madagascar in the Indian Ocean and started a magical pirate republic where pirates could be kings and the streets are paved with gold, and they're living the good life, right? What's that? In the hobos in the Great Depression, they had that something Candy Mountain, the sort of utopia that the hobos imagined in their songs. This is kind of like utopia for sailors and seamen. And so he was, this sort of a multimedia phenomenon of this story of the pirate who'd gotten away and become a pirate king. And Henry Avery had gone into piracy. He'd been a upstanding sailor, but he and his fellow sailors were basically cheated and screwed over by the owners of their ship. and they ended up, with their lives in danger and having been completely cheated by some of the most powerful men in England. They rose up in a mutiny and captured their ship and went off under their own account. And that story was the sort of inspiration and template for the pirates who came a generation later and started accumulating in the failed English colony of the Bahamas, and taking over and starting their own pirate republic. So Avery, in a sense, started the republic, but not literally. He provided the myth and storyline and narrative that inspired a future generation to start it up.
It's almost like fiction created the fact. That myth, and then people just wanting to buy into that, and this must be a great life.
With humans, it's all about narrative, right? We're a storytelling species, and a good story can transform the world.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about the ship that he found with the treasure in it, and one of the key plot points in Black Sails revolves around a ship called the Urca de Lima. And according to the series, she's the largest Spanish treasure galleon in the Americas, with a total cargo in excess of $5 million. And the storyline for the Urca carries throughout pretty much the entire series. But near the end of season 1, Captain Flint's crew hunts down the Urca. And that leads into season 2, when other pilots start to catch wind of the Urca gold, and it becomes this bargaining chip for most of the things that we see all the way up to the end. Not to get too far ahead of our story, we've already talked about how it's a prequel to Treasure Island. So you have to have treasure on that island, and the treasure is the one that's taken from the Urca. Is there any historical truth to the Urca de Lima story that we see in Black Sails?
Yeah, I probably should have checked this before. I'm pretty sure that is the actual name of one of the Spanish treasure galleons that went down when the 1715 treasure fleet had a calamity on the coast of Florida. Spain was by far and away the most powerful and wealthy of the transatlantic or global maritime empires based in Europe in that time period. And Spain controlled, everything, from Mexico on south in the entire hemisphere pretty much. And they had possessions in the Philippines and Guam and in Asia. And all of unlike the English, showing up in New England and Virginia, and the French showing up in Quebec, the Spanish, when they'd come, had discovered literally mountains of silver, and the Aztecs with their gold, and just incredible, comic book kind of riches, which they extracted with terrible brutality and, slaving people and slaughtering people. But all of that treasure and all the stuff that they were trading for in Asia all had to somehow get back to Spain. And the way it worked with, back in those days, square-rigged, large ocean-going vessels couldn't sail into the wind very well. The sails kind of flap, and you had to turn off the wind until the sails would catch. And in those, days, you could be sailing, 70 degrees off the wind, and you add some wind against your hull, and you add some waves, and you're not going anywhere. So my point is that ocean-going ships were pretty much compelled to follow established sea routes guided by the prevailing winds. And this compelled Spain to move all of their treasures from Asia across the Pacific to the Americas in a annual massive, Death Star-like treasure galleon, the Manila galleon, that started in the Philippines, stocked up all the treasure and sailed across the Pacific, would get to Acapulco and unload, and then under guard, these mule trains would take it over Mexico to Veracruz and load it into galleons, then come to Havana, their central base of their maritime part of their empire in the Americas. And then separately, all of that Incan silver and Aztec gold and all the other stuff that they were, extracting, exploiting, and stealing was all loaded onto vessels that also converged into Havana. And then once every year or two, it was all put onto an incredibly well-guarded treasure fleet, often known as the plate fleet. Plate was the word for silver back then. And the prevailing winds from Havana to get back to Spain required that you kind of be carried by the Gulf Stream up between Florida and the Bahama Islands before you can catch the prevailing winds to Iberia, to Spain. And so everybody knew this, but the treasure fleet was incredibly well guarded. And I can't remember, there's 7 or 9 vessels, of which I'm 99% certain the Urca de Lima was the name of the flagship. But in any case, they were sailing through the Straits of Florida in 1715. They'd been delayed trying to load by late arriving shipments and stuff. And it was a bumper-sized treasure load because there'd been a war going on. the War of Spanish Succession had ended the year before. So it was like several years worth of treasure accumulating on this one bumper treasure fleet. And then a hurricane struck as they were sailing up the Straits of Florida and blew them and destroyed the fleet up against the then uncolonized Florida coast in a whole stretch of sand now known as the Treasure Coast. And when all those ships were wrecked there with a gazillion, pounds worth of treasure and valuables, word got out rapidly to all four corners, right, of the Americas. And everybody was converging on to see if they couldn't get some, right, by diving, by salvaging, including the Spanish, who sent an entire, their survivors of their crew had set up a camp on the beach, and then they were sort of backed up by more soldiers and sailors and salvage operations. But yeah, the pirates would start laying siege to it and all the rest. So yeah, in the end, a pirate named Henry Jennings had charged in and attacked the Spanish camp. And remember, this is in time of peace too, but he did it anyway and got a massive cache of treasure, which is essentially the treasure that in Black Sails they're talking about. The Urca gold, the Urca silver is the stand-in for the treasure from the Spanish treasure fleet, of which Henry Jennings got a large quantity. And then being sort of a person on the run, he sailed to the sort of beginnings of this pirate republic in Nassau and arrived with all this treasure, which sort of transformed the status of the island and the pirate community there overnight. So yes, that part is true. And there was indeed a giant parcel of Spanish treasure that was injected into the early pirate republic and, brought it a new level of fame and an attraction to anyone who was looking to, maybe go onto the account.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking. Was you were talking about how with Henry Avery and there was just the allure to this lifestyle that was set forth in a lot of the fiction of the day. What you throw that gold in there, and that just had to be a new rush of people that were starting to be maybe adhering to the law is not what I want to do with my life. Let's go catch some of this treasure.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, people from all up and down the colonies all showed up there, and the Spanish were there too. And right, there was battles and people diving and people getting whatever they could. But remember, this is all happening right on the Florida coast, just across the straits from the Bahamas, which were a failed English colony. During that war I mentioned that had just ended in 1714, the War of Spanish Succession, the Bahamas had always been a backwater sort of colony, but it was sacked and destroyed by the French and Spanish, at least twice. And essentially, all the surviving English settlers were living in huts in the jungle kind of thing. And it's the pirates who started showing up there as early as 1714 in small little gangs using these dugout ocean-going canoes, these periaguas. Were starting to arrive and operate out of there. And ultimately, it's those folks who shored up the fort and put guns in it again and reestablished order. They got there before the British Empire bothered to get there and took it for themselves. And it's that pirate nest, that pirate republic, that makes possible a outbreak of piracy that was so effective that we're still talking about it today.
Wow. Yeah, I can understand why they left a lot of that out and just simplified it to here's the Urca gold and that's the pirate treasure, because that could be a whole series in and of itself. just telling that story. Near the end of season 2 in Black Sails, there's a pivotal sequence of events where we see Captain Flint being taken captive by the governor of the Carolinas, Lord Peter Ashe. And it turns out that Peter was a longtime friend of Flint and Flint's companion, Miranda Hamilton, back before Flint was even a pirate. He went by his real name, James McGraw. But Captain Flint is now a pirate. Lord Ashe is known in the area as, according to the series, as the toughest governor on pirates. So this sequence culminates in a trial for Captain Flint in Charlestown. What they don't realize is that Charles Vane has sailed up from Nassau, and at the last moment, he and his crew attack Charlestown to rescue Captain Flint and kill Lord Ashe in the process. In the series, it's always referred to as Charlestown in the Carolinas. Visually, we can see it's just off the coast, which plays into the sequence with Vane's attack on the town as the ship bombards it from the coast. So I'm assuming that this is present-day city of Charleston, South Carolina. Did pirates really attack Charleston like we see happening in the series there?
Yeah, so originally it was Charlestown. It got turned to Charleston after the American Revolution because it's named for King Charles. We were doing a lot of deroyalizing of things, right? Church of England became the Episcopalian Church and so on and so forth. So yes, it was originally Charlestown, and the Carolinas were known as Carolina in the West Indies, and then were later split into two colonies, South Carolina, Charlestown, and then a much poorer backwater sort of new and troubled colony, North Carolina, further north between Charleston and Virginia, which the Virginians looked down upon and the Charlestonians looked down upon. But Charlestown was founded by English planters from the island of Barbados, so slave lords who'd run out of land back on Barbados. And Barbados was the original like slave plantation colony in the English Empire. And it was a brutal Manichaean struggle between the people who first arrived there in the early 1600s. And by the time you get to the 1670s, when Charlestown was founded and the Carolina colony was starting to be colonized, a few families had won the Manichaean struggle and had perfected sort of a, brutal, lives for sugar slave system. And it becomes so rich in the process that when these people who were not pedigreed or from great families returned to England, they were the nouveau riche who could buy everything, like the Russians coming and, buying up, Kensington these days. These folks were showing up and offending all of the established families by being able to buy all their estates and all the rest, and were considered to have terrible manners and all of that, but they were incredibly rich. Well, when they ran out of land, they, on this tiny island, they turned to this new colony in the subtropical lowlands of the North American mainland and set up a new West Indies-style slave plantation society there, which is where you get the legacy culture of what became the Cotton South. Comes from transposing this model directly by the Barbadian planters themselves. So yes, that place existed and was very much tied into the West Indies. It was considered part of the West Indies, not separate from it. And so it was the port most intimately involved in the trade with the Pirate Republic in the Bahamas through intermediaries. And many of the people in the Bahamas had ties or connections in one way or another to Charlestown. Well, the scene you're describing where Flint, comes ashore to parley with the governor there, and then ends up, there ends up being him being captured, and then there ends up being Charles Vane showing up to liberate him. That's all keyed off a real historical event, which was one of the pirates they dropped from this, Stede Bonnet, was indeed captured and brought to Charlestown, where he was tried and to be hung. And there was some sort of popular uprising to storm the seat of power that almost succeeded and would have resulted in an overthrowing of the leadership of the South Carolina colony and liberation of Stede Bonnet. Ultimately, the uprising actually failed and Stede Bonnet was hanged there, but something like that did indeed happen, which is what they're keying off. It didn't involve Charles Vane, but the Attorney General there in South Carolina wrote letters about something terrible that they had just dodged. The details are kind of never discussed too much, but it's clear that his government almost fell when this uprising happened.
They probably weren't too keen on letting that out.
Yeah, and I would love somebody to dredge up more details about what happened there, but they're not they're not where they should be in the British National Archives.
Yeah, it was probably a little embarrassing for them, that kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely, right? Because it's a popular uprising by many of their own people and pirate sympathizers too, which is not something they want to broadcast.
In season 3, we see another character, Woodes Rogers, arriving in Nassau as he's the English governor tasked with kicking out the pirates and turning New Providence Island into, as the show puts it, a civilized English colony. And his first act there is to offer a pardon to anyone who returned from piracy, no questions asked. And a lot of people take the offer, a lot don't. Most notably in the series, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, and Edward Teach team up to try to defend the harbor against Rogers. And the only person who Rogers' offer does not extend to is the guy who was behind the attack in Charlestown, in the series at least, Captain Charles Vane. And then we see Vane getting captured, publicly hanged by Rogers in Nassau, which ends up turning into a spark for the pirate resistance against Woodes Rogers. But how accurate was the show's portrayal of what happened between Woodes Rogers and Charles Vane?
the part with the pardon and Woodes Rogers taking control of Nassau is almost completely as it really happened. It was Woodes Rogers' idea to have the king issue a pardon, and he had been lobbying for some time. He believed that through that you could have a divide and conquer strategy. So Woodes Rogers had been the greatest hero of that war that I mentioned that ended in 1714, the War of Spanish Succession. He'd been a privateer, and at a time when most privateers just went out into the English Channel and captured a French sloop and then went back into port and divided up the plunder and called it good. He built from scratch 2 frigate-sized warships, manned them with hundreds of men, and circumnavigated the planet at a time when very few people had done so to raid the Spanish shipping in the Pacific, which nobody, he had to go around the Tierra del Fuego and through the circumpolar storms going around Antarctica. And it took him, a couple of years, but he was seeking to capture one of those Manila galleons, and he did it. And he, in fact, got a musket ball in the jaw, and his brother was killed, just like the show says happened. And he eventually brought it through all kinds of trials and tribulations back all the way around the world backwards, around Africa and back up, and anchored it in the Thames. And he was the hero of the war. And he used that political capital from having done that and writing a best-selling book that they refer to in Black Sails as well, to lobby the king to issue this pardon. And he said, you issue the pardon and back my private, mercenary fleet with some Royal Navy vessels. And if I can go and take Nassau in the Bahamas, you'll make me governor. That was kind of the deal. I can be governor. You can be governor, Woodes Rogers, if you can take and hold this pirate nest. And so that was a deal worked out, and he did indeed come ashore. Charles Vane was not excluded from the list, but Charles Vane refused to participate. He was one of the diehards, right? The idea was divide and conquer, and a lot of pirates, including Hornigold and Jennings and many others, took the pardon, at least provisionally. And some didn't. Some were like, no way, we're not, we're committed to piracy. We hate England and all that. And Charles Vane was very much in the latter camp. And so when Woodes Rogers' fleet arrives, Charles Vane is the one who puts together this fire ship. He sets a ship on fire and sends it sailing straight towards the fleet, the English fleet that's arrived, just like is shown in Black Sails. He then escapes out the back. There's Nassau has you have Nassau and New Providence Island. You have a sandbar-like island that's now Paradise Island. It was then Hog Island, and they almost meet together, and that forms the harbor, a big, long, slit-like harbor. But if you're in a really small vessel, you could actually, instead of going out the ocean side of the harbor, you can go to the head of the harbor and navigate around the shoals and go out the back entrance if you're really small. He did that. He escaped out the back and then was at large for some time. So the Charles Vane defies the pardon, and causes all kinds of trouble part is correct, even if some of the details have been shifted around for dramatic purposes.
Yeah, no, that's impressive that, they stuck to a lot of the historic detail. Even I like that, the background of Woodes Rogers and that, getting shot, and because you see him with scars in the series, and he kind of explains that. And it's impressive.
His brother is killed by the musket ball. And I was amazed at the point where they have this scene in Black Sails where Woodes Rogers and his fleet, his mercenary vessels and the Royal Navy detachment are sailing with him. And like the name of every vessel and the size of it, all exactly right. They added one more vessel, that was going to be the one that was going to take Mrs. Guthrie back to be in prison, but all the other vessels were exactly right. And even the Commodore of the fleet was the real Commodore. So, a Chamberlain. So yeah, they would always zoom in, and when they had a chance to use the accurate details, they did. It was kind of fun for me to see a CGI of all the ships done well, right? So having read about them in the documents and, assembling what his fleet was like from all the documents when I was writing Republic of Pirates, and then see somebody, take that and recreate it was fun.
In the show, after the news of Charles Vane dies and that news reaches his old mentor, Edward Teach, that causes Teach to then return to Nassau. And we find out that another pirate, Captain Benjamin Hornigold, has aligned himself with Woodes Rogers and the British. So on one side, you have the British, led by Rogers and Hornigold, along with a bunch of British soldiers who came with Rogers. And then on the other side, you have the pirates, led by Captains Teach, Flint, Rackham, and John Silver. And the pirates have their own crews, but they also find an ally of their own in what the show calls the Maroons. They are Maroon slaves who set up their own village in secret and away from anybody else. The pirates convince them to help in trying to overthrow the British. And at least as of the end of season 3, it kind of works. The pirates managed to force the British to retreat from the island. Did any of this battle between pirates and England actually happen?
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, Woodes Rogers came ashore, he split the pirates, he occupied the fort. Hornigold and Jennings both joined him. Jennings actually became a pirate hunter trying to hunt down Charles Vane. So, all of that is pretty true to form. Rogers' governorship and reimposition of organized colonial rule was in jeopardy, though, for years thereafter, as the show is kind of suggesting. Disease did in fact break out among his people that the locals were not as susceptible to, and so a lot of his soldiers were dead or incapacitated. There was danger of renewed war with Spain, which the Black Sails touches on as well. He was in a very precarious spot, and Charles Vane and some of the other diehards, later Calico Jack Rackham, Mary Read, and Anne Bonny, take a small vessel and are reading things too. They're all at large. Before Rogers showed up, Vane came ashore and kind of reestablished piracy. The pardon came before Woodes Rogers did, word of the pardon. And it was brought to them by another ship and other governors. So the pirates, many of them before Woodes Rogers arrived, had already gone off to other colonial governors and gotten pardons and come back. So a lot of them had their pardons and Woodes Rogers took other pardons. But during this interval between when many of the pirates had decided, I'll take the pardon, that'll be great, and before Woodes Rogers arrived, Charles Vane showed up there and came down and kicked butt, said, no, we're going to be pirates again, and shook it all up again. And then when Rogers shows up, Vane has that fireship incident that covers his escape. And then he's spending all his time reading all the merchant shipping trying to come in and out of Nassau to basically make a mess of the finances and the commerce, which is really complicating Woodes Rogers' life. But there's no point where there's actually a siege by the pirates, reestablish order once Rogers is there. He's fearful of it. I mean, that's something he's watching his back the whole time, but it doesn't quite materialize in the same dramatic way it does in Black Sails. However, their whole idea, I love the idea that they took the potential plot lines of an alliance between the Maroons, the enslaved people who'd escaped and had set up long-time Maroon settlements, they called them, deep in the interior. The famous one was deep in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. There was a whole society there of escaped slaves they had their own matriarchal queen leader, just like Black Sails suggests. The governors in the real history surrounding the Bahamas were all terrified by the Bahamas because the pirates let people of African descent join their crews and rise up to become captains. And, the word that you could be treated as a human got around. And a lot of slaves were ready the governor of Bermuda said that the rumor was that the pirates were going to come invade Bermuda and that the slaves knew this and were going to rise up with them to take Bermuda and turn it into another pirate nest like Nassau. So all of that was a real concern. It never actually materialized in our own history, but it absolutely could have. And if you're going to expand out and dramatize and elongate the Pirate Republic, if I were a show director, I would have totally gone to that material too. It's mentioned in Republic of Pirates and it's all out there, but I like that they decided to take that and the tensions, that the genuine distrust that the Maroon communities would have of the pirates, because the pirates were also, yes, people of African descent were fellow humans. If they were, it appears to be from the evidence that if you were a fellow, born in the Americas person, it didn't matter what race you were, you could all join the pirate crews. But when they would capture a slave ship with, people chained in the hold coming straight from Africa, who's, speaking weird languages, strange customs, right? They're not Americanized. Pirates would often just treat them as things, right? Sell them as cargo and all the rest, just like the slaveholders. So it seems like it was from the evidence, the pirates' attitudes were defined not by race but by cultural foreignness. Right, the people who were from Africa they would other and treat as things, but the fellow sailors and people in the New World seemed to be treated as fellow sailors and people and pirates. So a mixed bag there, but
yeah, and it makes. I mean, they're pirates, so there's the level of trust. I don't know that I would have that there too. But also, when you have some of the pirates that are taking the pardon and basically switching sides, it sounds like. I mean, do you know that this person who was a pirate before, are they still, or have they turned to the law and then going to turn you in? Like, I mean,
what's to lose? I mean, not only did the pirates get the pardon, but they would be absolved of all their prior acts of piracy, and they could keep their stuff, the loot. So why wouldn't you do it? It's just like you just got absolved for all the piracy you've done so far. Are you going to do more? Well, we'll wait and see. But at least I've cleared the slate. So it took real diehard types who were especially furious at England and organized society to not be tempted by the pardon. But some of the people like Hornigold and Jennings took the pardon and never looked back and became sort of right-hand lieutenants to the historical Woodes Rogers in his effort to consolidate control and bring civilization back.
Well, in the final season of the series, it's pretty clear that Wood Rogers is not going to stay away for long. He gets, as I mentioned, pushed out for a little bit, comes back, but his fleet manages to track down Edward Teach's ship, and after boarding it, they overpower the pirates. Edward Teach, Anne Bonny, and Jack Rackham are captured by Wood Rogers. And he wants to make an example of Edward Teach, Blackbeard. So in episode 3, season 4, he calls for really one of the most horrendous tortures. They put a bag over his head, tie his hands and legs, tie a rope to his feet, hang him upside down over the side of the ship, and then using a rope connected to his hands, they pull him under the water from one side of the ship, scraping his body against the bottom of the ship. Comes back up. He's a bloody mess when he comes back up. But Teach survives the torture 3 different times. Each time, more flesh is ripped open by the salt water. In the end, he's barely recognizable. Everybody is just surprised he's not dead each time. And then Rogers ends up shooting him in the head after the 3rd time. Is that really how Blackbeard died?
That's called keel hauling, and that was a punishment the Royal Navy would mete out to sailors in the Royal Navy who had been bad. Usually not done until it was fatal, but it would tear up your back against the barnacles. And Woodes Rogers in Black Sails is seeking to basically to use this as a method of execution by repeating it until the guy's dead, which is, to terrorize the other pirate captives and show that he means business. The real Woodes Rogers was a mixed bag, but he didn't have this same sort of like sadistic intensity that the Black Sails Woodes Rogers had. He also never laid eyes on Blackbeard at any point. So when word of the pardon started arriving in the Americas, remember there was no radio or TV, so once the king had issued a pardon, it had to be sent out on ships and physically in pieces of paper, and word literally had to get around. Right, communication is only as fast as transportation back then, and so it took a while. There'd be delays of weeks or even a month or two between when each colony or port knew about this. And Blackbeard was out cruising with his fleet when word started coming around. We know the moment pretty much when he learned of the pardon. He learns it from a vessel he's captured he's working his way up the Leeward Islands, and he goes off to try to make a final score in the Gulf of Mexico. So he's off in the Gulf of Mexico theater, and eventually comes around to take a pardon from a corrupt governor in the poorest colony of them all, North Carolina. Remember, I mentioned it had been a sort of backwater, relatively new colony. It had just survived a war between the colonists and the indigenous people who didn't want them there. And he goes to the governor of this place in this little town of 600 that sometimes serves as its capital. And he just shows up there and says, "Hey, I want to take your pardon." And, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I'm just gonna set myself up in the trash collection business, right? And if I keep finding piles of gold out to sea while I'm going to dump the trash, I'll sell them to you. And my men are all the indigenous people attack again. I've just almost doubled the population of your army. With all these battle-tested men around me. So basically, he buys off the protection of the governor in this scheme where he'll become an underworld crime figure protected by the cops, the mayor. He's bought off the authorities in this tiny colony, and he's fencing his goods to them. So if you're the governor in this impoverished place, suddenly you have all these goods coming in to pay your debts, and you've got all these well-trained people who know how to handle weapons to help keep your place secure. So he goes for that. So Blackbeard never crosses paths with Woodes Rogers, but his death is not unlike what they show in Black Sails. So another governor who was very unscrupulous was the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood. And Spotswood, with no authority whatsoever, invaded North Carolina. He conspired with the captains of the 2 Royal Navy vessels posted in Hampton Roads, and they did a 2-pronged invasion using sort of like as mercenaries. And basically Blackbeard is surprised at Ocracoke Island. And there's a battle not between Woodes Rogers and Blackbeard, but a battle between a Lieutenant Maynard, the Royal Navy sailor in charge of the detachment sent to go capture him. And it happens very much like they depict in Black Sails. There's a broadside across the decks of the sloop that the Royal Navy sailors are on. Blackbeard and his men board it thinking they've won the day. There's bodies on the deck. And then all of a sudden, it's an ambush coming out from the hold. Come all the Royal Navy sailors and Lieutenant Maynard who've been hiding down there, surprise them. There's a giant battle just like in Black Sails. And ultimately, Lieutenant Maynard, and his men kill Blackbeard and behead him and take the head back home to their governor as a prize, where it's placed on what's now known as Blackbeard's Point in Hampton Roads, Norfolk, Virginia. So the manner of death is correct. It's out of sequence in the timeline, and the person who did it is completely different. But yeah, that's what became of Blackbeard. And they pay homage to all that in having Woodes Rogers take on Blackbeard, but they set up the battle to be very similar to what actually happened to Blackbeard in Ocracoke Sound in 1718.
Wow. Yeah. It's not, another example of how they're fitting it into their story, of course, but still adhering to history pretty well, it sounds like.
Yeah. It's like Woodes Rogers gets to take on some of Spotswood's, unscrupulousness, and then gets to play the dashing Errol Flynn-like Lieutenant Maynard character in his battle with Blackbeard. Okay, you kind of tie them all together. But again, they could have made it up any way they wanted. They intentionally echoed what actually happened to Blackbeard in history when they decided how that battle would play out, which, as a historian, it's like, hey, if you're going to do it, yeah, right on.
As I was watching that, you mentioned the keel hauling of Blackbeard. It really kind of struck me that, that Woodes Rogers was sent there to be the English governor who's supposed to be returning the island to the civilized world. And although pirates have been romanticized throughout much of pop culture, I think everyone knows that they're brutal murderers without regard for law and order. They're pirates. But we don't really think of the brutality on the other side, the brutality of those in a position of law and order. Were the actions of what we call a civilized nation of the time just as brutal as the pirates were?
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's what, really came through in researching the pirate story for when I was writing The Republic of Pirates was, the authorities needed to cast them as, demons, villains of all nation, devil people, trying to bring down all that is right and true. And when you really look at it, though, even though all this propaganda was out there, the pirates themselves, most of them, Charles Vane's an exception, but Blackbeard and Bellamy and most of these other pirates, you read through all of the surviving documents, and all the documents are from unsympathetic witnesses. They're all from the victims of the pirates, or the accounts we have of what happened. The pirates didn't leave any letters or anything behind for us. So we have we have depositions given to officials and then court testimony. And despite that, like Blackbeard, right? Bloodthirsty, scary Blackbeard didn't harm or kill anybody in any of these accounts. There's probably 14, 15 different piracy attacks on ships. He scares people. He acts threatening and says, I'm going to do terrible things unless you do what I want. And so everyone does what he wants, but he doesn't have to hurt anybody until his final battle with the Royal Navy in Ocracoke Sound. And if you compare that restraint by these particular outlaws to what, the legally sanctioned people are doing, like privateers like Henry Morgan I mean, oh my God, Henry Morgan, like, you know, goes to Panama and sacks a city and like kills every single person, and man, woman, and child, just for fun. And the law, you know, children in London, you know, caught starving children stealing loaves of bread, you know, are executed, and orphans are, you know, sold to people who are chimney sweep operators who send the small children up and down the chimneys to scrape them out personally until they fall to their deaths or, you know, die of, you know, not being able to breathe anymore. I mean, it's like brutal, terrible time, and official and legally sanctioned violence, when you really start reading into it, is considerably worse than what the pirates were actually doing. So yeah, it's a brutal time, but the pirates seem to be acting with remarkable restraint in their actions compared to the norm of violence around them.
It leads to another aspect of understanding why people would turn to piracy when they're seeing that law and order is not really law and order anyway. Then, I mean, especially if all this Spanish gold is crashed off the coast, why not go get it?
Yeah, and you know, there were many reasons for the outbreak of piracy, but most among them is that, you know, the world of the English Empire was starting to get much more difficult for ordinary people. Now, this is in the middle of the sort of what they call the enclosure movement. So all of the relationships between lord and serf in the countryside in England were kind of breaking down. You know, serfs were on, their families would be on 100-year leases for their little scrap of land. But there was suddenly these incentives as the beginnings of industry were start to happen for the lords to get rid of this 150 individual little plots of subsistence farms and make one big sheep pasture and grow sheep for the wool to send to the woolen mill would be a much better deal. So over the decades leading up to this, a lot of the lords were not renewing the lease, which was just like, what? You know, that wasn't even a possibility in people's minds. And so tons of people from the countryside, massive numbers, were moving destitute into the cities. That's where the Dickensian phrases about the surplus population and the social Darwinists would use at the end of the 19th century. This is what was driving it. And if you were a person in the worst possible situation coming to the cities, you had absolutely no prospects. The last straw thing you would do to survive would be to go be a sailor, because being a sailor was staggeringly dangerous and paid terribly, and the food was awful and all the rest. But you would, you know, the line was, it was much like being in prison, except with the added possibility of drowning, right? It was something you didn't do unless you had to. And people were doing that. And then the War of Spanish Succession comes along, you know, and when the war ended, the British Navy reduced its size of its force by 2/3 and just dumped all these Royal Navy sailors on the docks. And then the labor market had a supply-demand problem, and a lot of merchants were like, we'll pay these people 1/3 as much as we used to, which was already starvation wages. And so people were just getting cheated, and the system was consolidating. The sort of emergence of an English upper class who would send their children to different schools, who would speak a language different than the other people, like with their own dialects. That all that stuff was starting to happen, and the resistance to it was starting to build. And the pirates, the sailors, were in this one position where they're operating out of the reach of the law on these ships, right? And the possibility of resisting and taking over the ship, they're the sort of the people who had the most opportunity to, if they were fed up, to finally do something about it in a way that you couldn't on land back in England. And so the piracy outbreak, I say all this because when the pirates start saying, you know, we're not just brigands, we're Robin Hood's men, right? We're fighting back, we're fighting the man on behalf of all the people who are getting screwed. People on both sides of the Atlantic were like, yeah, like they were buying the pirate story despite everything the authorities were doing, which made the pirates folk heroes, which led to that uprising to free Stede Bonnet, that led Alexander Spotswood not to dare to share his plans to stop the pirates with his own House of Burgesses, his own assembly, because there were so many pirate sympathizers in Virginia. And it led to the publication of a book in 1724, when some of these pirates were still active, called A General History of the Pirates, alleged history. It's a mix of things that are perfectly accurate, almost quoting official documents, and other things that are made up. But the point is, this book was a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, and it cast the pirates in pretty good light. Every pirate mythic story you've heard basically comes from this book, including Treasure Island and all the rest. and because it was such a hit. And the point is, the pirates at the time were folk heroes because, rightly or wrongly, people bought their version of the story that, hey, we're fighting the system and the system's evil. And a lot of people felt like the system was being pretty evil back then.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like in many cases it was.
Oh, absolutely. And, in my book, it kind of describes just how bad it was. And again, it's also echoing Henry Avery, whose crew was betrayed in the most terrible ways by some of the most powerful people in England. And they're like, we've had enough. We're just going to seize this ship and, go live a merry life in a short one. That was the fantasy. And something about that spirit, had grabbed onto the public imagination then and hasn't let go yet.
Well, if we go back to the series, we see Woodes Rogers can't seem to get any support from England anymore. So he turns to the Spanish governor in Havana, Cuba, to help him put down the pirate and maroon rebellion. And according to the show, Spain and England are at war. So the Spanish are not likely to help Woodes Rogers. But then Rogers points out that if pirates and slaves are allowed to take Nassau, then word's going to spread and there's going to be even more uprisings of pirates and slaves. And on top of that, Rogers also mentions that they have the Urca gold, and we talked about earlier that the pirates are using to fund their future ventures. And the only way for Spain to get that back is to help him. So then we see in the series, Rogers returns to Nassau with a Spanish fleet. There's violent fighting in Nassau, and they destroy many of the plantations of the island as well. We see Rogers killing his own wife, Eleanor Guthrie. That was kind of by accident. He didn't do it himself in the series, but sent people off and she died. And then, so we get this idea of the English going to the Spanish for help to form kind of an alliance to put down the pirates and slaves on New Providence Island. Is any of that historically accurate?
I mean, if I were a showrunner, I need to figure out how to have some excitement. I might have come up with something like that. But no, in the real universe, Woodes Rogers definitely wouldn't have done that. I mean, Woodes Rogers had many flaws. He had some kind of personality flaw that we don't know exactly what it is, but what we do know is that he managed to make enemies of all sorts of Royal Navy captains and other people who need to be his allies. It results in him being suddenly dismissed as the governor of the Bahamas and sent back home. He ends up in debtor's prison for a while before in the 1730s he's returned to Nassau. I mean, he obviously had some kind of, social bilateral screw loose. But one thing he definitely was a patriot in the English sense. He didn't like the Spanish. His brother had been killed in that raid. He wanted to, he had expended a lot of energy in the period between his round the world trip and going to Nassau and wanting to figure out a way to placate another pirate nest in Madagascar, the place that Henry Avery was supposed to go to. He'd invested in large amounts of Bibles and approached the Church of England for sort of a messianic effort to bring the word of God to the pirates to sort of shift them morally. So he was like really committed to bringing law and order about. And he didn't like the Spanish. And in a time of war, he wouldn't have turned to them in reality. But what rings true is the Spanish did indeed try to attack Nassau later on and try to seize the place. That was always a danger. And had, in an alternate timeline, had the pirates and the maroon communities and enslaved people form this kind of alliance, maybe you'd end up in a situation where a governor might have, or where England would have approached Spain, or they would have had similar interests. None of that, though, quite happened. What they're doing there is they're sort of foreshadowing the Haitian Revolution, which would come a century later, where enslaved people really did rise up and take over a colony and wipe out the planters and form their own republic. And it's sort of like they're imagining, let's say we were a century earlier and somehow the pirates acted as a catalyst and formed an alliance, and that happened earlier and that it happened in Nassau. Yeah, it's kind of a neat, if you're trying to create an alternate history sort of event, that's a pretty cool one. And that would have been threatening. Hey, Haiti's uprising, even the early 19th century, was something that terrified, the power base everywhere, including the United States, by the idea that enslaved people would not only rise up successfully, but would build their own country and their own republic. That was deeply threatening to all sorts of things. So yeah, the themes are interesting, but it didn't happen in the 1710s, and Woodes Rogers would not have been a part of it.
It sounds like putting a lot of things that could have happened, especially with the Orca gold too, because that plot point makes sense too, of like the Spanish are wanting their gold back. So it just seems to make sense that it could have happened, even if it didn't.
Yeah, and the governor in Havana was furious in the real world timeline at the gold being seized and by this pirate's nest not being pacified, and there was this constant threat that an invasion fleet would come. At one point, I think just bad weather turned back a Spanish invasion fleet that would have destroyed Nassau and burned it to the ground. So there are fears that come up over and over again among the pirates that their nest could be destroyed and their sort of zone of freedom as they see it would be destroyed by the Spanish was absolutely true and was a constant menace facing the Pirate Republic and Woodes Rogers, early post-Pirate Republic, which was on thin ice and, provisional state for many, many years after his arrival in 1718.
If we go back to the series, near the end, there's a climactic showdown at a new location called Skeleton Island. And according to the show, Skeleton Island is a place that's not on any charts. The Spanish used it to conduct illicit transactions for decades, but then Henry Avery was the first Englishman to find it. This is all according to the show. And then when he gets there, Henry Avery gets there, he finds a Spanish ship that sets sail from Havana in 1636. The captain's log says there were 31 souls. Avery finds the remains of all 31 on ship. It's locked from inside the ship's hold. There's some evidence that some of them were dismembered while still alive. So it starts to add this idea of this island being haunted. And then in the series, Captain Flint is recounting the story in the show. And he says, the rumor is that the crew refused to go inland after the first few came back with reports of hearing strange sounds and voices. And this is the setting for where Woodes Rogers and Captain Flint have their final battle once and for all in the series. Not to get too far ahead, we'll talk about the battle, but when we see Captain Flint actually burying the treasure from the Urca, it's been a key part of the story throughout the entire series. So the impression I got was, this is Treasure Island from Robert Louis Stevenson's novel. Is there any truth to the location and legends of Skeleton Island?
Yeah, I think at that point, they're pulling in the setting for Treasure Island, because the plot of that is they're trying to find an elderly Billy Bones arrives at this little kid's family, the inn. A little kid family owns an inn in the West Country of England. This old man pirate, who's Billy Bones, shows up as a guest. He ends up dying while he's there, and he has a treasure map. And the kid ends up on this involved in this adventure to go find the treasure left by Captain Flint. And he ends up, the cook on the vessel he's on is a guy named Long John Silver, an old man who leads a mutiny to take things over, and they go to Skeleton Island. So in the end, to bond the fictional world of Robert Louis Stevenson to the pirate world, they need Skeleton Island to be the fulcrum point, which has them shifted there. But no, the island didn't exist, and there wasn't anything like that. The closest you could say, there are a couple of things. The idea of there's a stranded sailor there who's been stuck on this island in Robert Louis Stevenson's book. And that is all modeled off the real Robinson Crusoe. Alexander Selkirk was a guy actually stranded on an island in the middle of the Pacific alone for years and years and years, surviving off goats and stuff. And his story became very famous in England. So tapping on that was already a trope. Well, he was rescued by who? Alexander Selkirk, the real Robinson Crusoe, was rescued by Woodes Rogers during the circumnavigation of the planet, right? He just happened by and they found this guy. So the Robinson Crusoe story, the real story, was first publicized in Woodes Rogers' book. And so that part has some echoes that Robert Louis Stevenson ended up using. That island would have been in the Pacific Ocean instead. The other element is that pirates, the real pirates in the Caribbean, had all sorts of pirate lairs they would go to, including abandoned or unoccupied islands outside the view of the major sea lanes. They would go into those places to clean the bottoms of their vessels. There's a whole thing about careening a vessel in I think in season 1 of Black Sails, which was all true. You had to kelp and stuff would grow on the bottom of the hull of your vessel and slow it down, which could result in your death if you're a pirate. So they regularly had to find a beach where they could at high tide bring it in and lay it on its side, and then when the tide goes out, scrape all the stuff off the bottom and then get it back seaworthy again. That you can't do that. They don't have shipyards, so they can't go somewhere safe to do this. They actually have to do this somewhere where they hope the authorities won't happen by while their ship's careened or otherwise incapacitated. So they had all kinds of lairs like Skeleton Island where pirates would go to do R&R, to repair ships, to, find fresh water, or to hang out and just recover, when far from Nassau. And they were often far from Nassau. I mean, the pirates based in the Bahamas raided as far north as Newfoundland in Canada, in what's now Canada, and as far south as the Spanish Main and Venezuela. So, or even some of them even down to the coast of Brazil. So, it was thousands of miles of range with the Bahamas in the middle, but there were often times when you needed some other place of refuge. So there were many skeleton islands scattered all over the place. And finally, even, there were places where you could go to fence your goods. There's a famous place, Gardiner's Island, if you look at Long Island in New York, which starts in New York City and goes out, along Long Island Sound, it ends in a fork. And in the fork, the seaward fork, there's a little island in the middle. That's Gardiner's Island, where Captain Kidd went and fenced his treasure to the Gardiner family, who were the proprietors of the island until just a few years ago. They're like 13 generations of them had been proprietors of this island continuously. And after Captain Kidd, the next generation fenced the goods for Sam Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams and others. So there were places you would know you could go, not to hide treasure in the ground, but to parlay your treasure with the sort of, Cayman Islands / Swiss bankers of the era.
I like that. That comparison there.
Yeah, the offshore bankers. They had them then too.
The offshore bankers, again, quite literally. In some cases.
Rhode Island was very open in the kind of capital they would bring in and deal with too at the time.
Wow. Well, we go back to the series. There's the battle I mentioned on Skeleton Island. I already mentioned Captain Flint buried his gold there. And the fighting between the pirates seems to come to an end when Woodes Rogers burns John Silver's ship in the harbor while Flint is fighting Silver in Israel hands. And then just then, Captain Jack Rackham shows up with his own ship. There's another battle on the ship that ensues, and Woodes Rogers ends up a prisoner of the pirates, but they don't kill him. The reason for that in the series is because Rackham went to Philadelphia with Max to strike a deal with Eleanor Guthrie's grandfather. The Guthries are a rich and powerful family in the series. So even though her grandfather refuses the deal publicly, her grandmother Marion agrees to it. There's all the political intrigue going on in the series. She turns out to be the one in power anyway. Not really the grandfather, it's the grandmother that's the one in power. So she finances the support to oust Woodes Rogers as governor from England's perspective, while Rackham and Max help the Guthries get control of Nassau under a new governor. So once Rogers is in pirate custody, he's basically sent back to England to face his crimes. Is that a pretty good portrayal of what really happened to Woodes Rogers?
Well, that we don't have the Guthrie angle. Woodes Rogers loses his governorship unceremoniously and ends up in debtor's prison. He's eventually bailed out of it, and he has all kinds of difficulties and travails, but people feel bad for him about 20 years later and send him back as governor, and he dies in the Bahamas in the 1730s. So he had a bad go of it, but he wasn't like imprisoned for his crimes and all that sort of thing in the real world timeline. But why was he removed from his governor's post? That's never totally clear. He's kind of left high and dry by England. He's constantly saying, the Spanish are about to invade. I need help. I'm out of money. He's having to shell out his own money to pay, troops and to bring in, cannonballs and provisions and things to hold this colony for England. And all of his pleas for help go unanswered back, in London. So, and then eventually they recall him. So, could there have been some additional plotting going on behind the scenes? Yeah, sure, hypothetically. To kind of get rid of him. Somebody else was in there as governor for quite some time after Rogers left, before he ended up returning as an old man. So there's enough room for a maybe scenario tossed in there, but we don't have any evidence as such.
One of the things that we see in this series is Jack Rackham is kind of he's a wheeler and dealer throughout the entire series, but at the end, part of the deal is that he makes with the Guthries in England is basically that he wants to be the one to help tell the story of Woodes Rogers' downfall in the historical record. So very heavily suggests in the series that he was given that opportunity. Do we know if Jack Rackham was involved in the Wood Rogers story at all?
Yeah, no, Woodes Rogers kind of gets to tell his own story in that the only telling of this story in any form really comes in the general history of the pirates, the book I described. And if you're like me, parsing this book where some of it is completely made up fantasy and some of it is absolutely right, almost down to the word, and you're trying to figure out the passages you don't know which one isn't, right? So I was constantly like annotating backwards. Where did this come from? Where did they find that? If I don't have any source for it, is this possibly true? And what you start figuring out is anything that Woodes Rogers could have been the source for about things that were happening in Nassau, the book is pretty accurate on. And a lot of the documents, like you'd see the basically sort of secret documents from Woodes Rogers back to London, that they're quoting from them in real time, documents that whoever had this book shouldn't have access to. So, I mean, there's a good case to say that basically Woodes Rogers was approached by the person who wrote, under a pseudonym, wrote this book and cooperated with them to sort of tell his story. And through that book going out, that's what rehabilitates Woodes Rogers' reputation in England and makes people a little more sympathetic to him, and eventually results in him being sent back to being governor. So I think Woodes Rogers got his story out through another writer. Calico Jack was dead by then. The book, the series portrays him as sort of a thinking pirate, a talker, but who's very concerned the whole time about his legacy and about making his mark. The real Calico Jack was, there's not that much sign of deep substance there. He ends up leading a vote against Charles Vane and deposing Charles Vane as captain and being elected captain himself. And then his whole captaincy and his second trip out with Mary Read and Anne Bonny are not very successful pirate trips. He takes all kinds of risks he shouldn't take. Mary Read and Anne Bonny all get captured and sent off to Jamaica for trial because, he's operating in a small vessel around the waters of Jamaica, which are the most dangerous place to be. He's like, basically, committing crimes in front of the police station, as it were, and gets caught by the police, right? It's just like really dumb stuff. And you're like, what are you thinking? So, he didn't seem to be particularly good at being a pirate. And so his reign as an independent pirate captain was very short and resulted in his hanging in Jamaica. So he was not available to tell any stories.
Yeah. Well, speaking of kind of how his story ended, but I thought overall Black Sails did a pretty good job of wrapping up the storylines at the very end of the series, kind of leading into Treasure Island. We talked a little bit about that. In this series, we see John Silver ending up with the Maroon leader, Maddie, although initially she's not happy with the peace in Nassau. Wasn't really the kind of peace that they had fought for. And we see Silver finds out that the love of Flint's life, Thomas Hamilton, is alive in a plantation near Savannah, Georgia, where people from England make other people disappear. So he arranges for Flint to go there so he can let Captain Flint as a character die, and then he becomes James McGraw again. Be reunited, yeah. And then back in Nassau, there's a new governor that gets installed as a former pirate named Mr. Featherstone that we kind of see throughout. Although the real power, according to the series, it seems like it was going to be with Max, kind of like the real power in Philadelphia is marrying Guthrie and not really her husband. And then since the governor is a former pirate who just happened to be second in command on Captain Jack Rackham's ship, the last moments of the series, we see Captain Rackham going back out to sea with Anne Bonny, and then a new recruit named Mark Reed in this series. Is there any other realistic elements as far as how the show ends that we see?
They elongate and prolong the tension over what's going to happen to Nassau by quite a bit, and have entire invasions didn't happen, and the alliance with the Maroons and that uprisings, and there's a whole series of wars that didn't really take place. In terms of how it all ends, it doesn't end with any pirate veterans as governors. That would be difficult because one station mattered a great deal back then. A person born poor was just not going to be appointed to be the permanent governor of anywhere. Somebody else would be sent in, which is what happened. But some of these pirates did end up, respectable members of the restored Nassau society, merchant leaders. And I think some of them may have even ended up on the governing council, the governor's council of sort of advisors and stuff. So they were people who became upper middle class, as we might call it, afterwards within the new regime. And the Bahamas eventually stabilizes. It takes really a decade or two for it to happen, but it eventually does so, and carries on without leaving the British Empire to return to piracy again.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about Black Sails. Before I let you go, I want to shift to your book, which I have here, The Republic of Pirates. Can you share a sneak peek of your book for someone who wants to learn more about the true story?
Sure. Well, this book, I was researching it long before the Black Sails existed and many of these other shows that you've seen. And my quest was to figure out who these pirates actually were, back to the archives, separate fact from fiction, and solve many of the mysteries around them. So this was the first time, I think probably in 40 years, that someone had really tried to go into the archives and do this kind of work. And when I was doing this in 2005, 2006, when I was doing the initial research on this book, I was kind of the first person to go in with the digital tools available, where the first versions of the big microfilm collections used to have to, if you want to look at the newspapers there, you had to go through the microfilm of each newspaper individually, right? It's incredibly laborious. If you wanted to, if you couldn't keyword search it, you couldn't say, I wonder who this, Featherstone guy is. If he shows up, nobody could have, searched for Featherstone in every newspaper and seen what you could come up with. Well, now I could, right? The first keyword searchable database versions where everything was in PDF or in OCR'd images was happening. And you could do the work of, 20 people in 1950, you could do as one person with, the catalogs and other things available, and then use that to triangulate and figure out where documents might lie. And most of it was done in the National Archives in the UK, where most of the primary source info was. Digging in things like, people had looked at the official records of each colony and each government, but nobody had really plumbed the Admiralty, the Navy's records, which included not only logbooks of all these various vessels, some of them mentioned in the general history of the pirates, but also the letters of their captains. And the captains were the primary intel, agents trying to keep track of these pirates on behalf of the empire. So with their letters, there was all kinds of gold mines of things that people didn't know about yet. And if you started tracking each individual pirate, like in a spreadsheet and on a piece of paper, where were they on this day? What's the prevailing winds? Which direction were they headed? Where did they have to be the next day if they were going to end up, you see them here, and then 5 days later they're here. Where did they have to go in between to get there? And then that would allow you to say, okay, which colonial official was there? And go dig up that colonial officials, look them up alphabetically, figure out where their letters are, and see, did they see a pirate vessel go by them? And maybe a previous researcher had said, they mentioned a pirate vessel, but who knows who it is? Well, you know who it is, especially when they describe the vessel that matches. So it allowed all kinds of, by triangulating in all different ways, rebuilding their story, because if you organized everything in that way, you could kind of figure out where people were, where they were going next, and where the archival treasure lay that would solve various mysteries. So we rolled that all together and told the story of this pirate republic, primarily through 4 principal characters that it focuses on, because it tells the story well. Blackbeard, Wax and Bellamy, indeed Charles Vane, who was not a well-known pirate then, and Woodes Rogers, who, the understanding of him as being the person who overthrew the pirate republic was not well focused on either. So I sort of put that all together and told the story of this gang of pirates and how they'd captured our imagination and why. Both because they were super effective, because they had this pirate base, but also for the ideological reasons of they cast themselves not as criminals, but as Robin Hood's men, and many people agreed with it. So that was the sort of story in a nutshell.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time.
Pleasure. Anytime.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Colin Woodard once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in the TV series Black Sails. And if you want to learn more about the true story, hop into the show notes for a link to get Colin's excellent book called The Republic of Pirates, being the true and surprising story of the Caribbean pirates and the man who brought them down. As always, you can find a link to Colin's book on the show's home on the web as well at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/329. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1. Black Sail's backstory for Woodes Rogers being shot in the face really happened. Number 2. Skeleton Island is not a real island. Number 3. Woodes Rogers really did kill Blackbeard the way we see in the series. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's start with number 1. Black Sail's backstory for Woodes Rogers being shot in the face really happened. That is true. As Colin told us, even though we don't see it happening in the show because it's before the timeline of the series, it is true that Woodes Rogers took a musket ball in the jaw and his brother was killed, just like Black Sails says happened, which ends up leading to some more tension between Rogers and Spanish in the series. And even though those things didn't necessarily happen as far as Woodes Rogers' backstory that we hear in the show, that part did happen. That brings us to number 2. Skeleton Island is not a real island. That is also true. And just to clarify, by true, I mean it is true that Skeleton Island is not a real island. The Skeleton Island that we see in season 4 of Black Sails comes from Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Treasure Island. So the series has to do some combining of the true history with a fictional novel. Although, as Colin pointed out, even Treasure Island was based on some truth because he told us about the story of Alexander Selkirk, who was stranded on an island in the Pacific for years and years until he was rescued by, who would you guess? Woodes Rogers. That means the lie is number 3. Woodes Rogers really did kill Blackbeard the way we see in this series. That's a lie because, as Colin explained, in the true story, Woodes Rogers never even laid eyes on Blackbeard. With that said, though, Colin also mentioned that the bloody torture that we see Woodes Rogers doing to Blackbeard in the series, that was a real thing the Royal Navy did, called keel hauling. And then there's the way of Blackbeard's demise, which actually was similar to what we see in the series, even if it was not at the hand of Woodes Rogers. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Before I let you go, I want to share that I have started up an email newsletter for Based on a True Story, so you can sign up for that at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/newsletter. And don't forget, if you heard ads on today's episode, you can get rid of those by subscribing to the producer's feed that is available natively in the Apple Podcast app just by tapping on subscribe on the show's homepage. Or if you're using any other podcast app, you can access ad-free versions on the producer's feed over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/Patreon. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.